everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to the IASW celebration of World Social Work Day 2021. My name is Kerry Cuskley and I'm a member of the International Committee of the IASW who organised today's event. There are lots of other people involved in organising it. I actually have to admit I did very little apart from being here today and talking to you in terms of the organisation. But towards the end, I'll of course thank everybody, but just to say well done on everybody getting today's event organised and up off the ground. And I think that it will be a really enjoyable and a really nice celebration of World Social Work Day, and also a chance for us to reflect on the last year, which has for everyone, I imagine, been incredibly different, incredibly complex. And I think this year's theme for World Social Work Day, Ubuntu, I am because we are, is absolutely perfect and couldn't be more spot on and perfect for us to actually take some time and reflect on where we have been and where we are, and I think actually where we would like to be as a social work profession into the following year, and indeed into the future, both on a national and on a global level. And I was checking Twitter, as I normally do today earlier on, looking at all of the different World Social Work Day tweets, and I think some of that is being reflected online and globally as well, with people talking about maybe taking the chance today for us as social workers to think about what we have contributed, and what we can actually contribute, and the solutions we can offer going forward on a global level to contributing to a changed and a more progressive and a more socially cohesive and solidarity focused society. And today's presenters will absolutely talk about all of that and more, and I really hope that everybody will be able to be part of that conversation. And on that note, for everyone who is joined in, whether you're on a mobile device or whether you're on a laptop, I want you to do two things. I want you to keep checking the Q&A tab, which is on your top right hand side if you're on a laptop. It might be on the bottom if you're on a phone. I want you to put questions in or comments or thoughts as much as possible throughout the next hour and a half when people are talking, so we can maybe get a conversation started. And I'd also like you to use the hashtags if you are tweeting or you are on any social platform. So we're working off of WSWD 2021 and SW Responds as our two hashtags. So please do tweet away and tag the ISW account, IASW_IRL, when you're doing that. So without further ado, I think that I will introduce the first speaker. Our first speaker is the wonderful Dr. Chéile Dalekeny. Chéile is a member of the board of the Irish Association of Social Workers. She is one of the wonderful leaders of the Anti-Racism Advisory Group in the ISW. She has years of extensive experience as a social worker and an educator and a researcher. She is currently based at Dundalk Institute of Technology. Chéile engages in emancipatory activist research and also focuses very much on culturally competent social work practice with various ethnic minority groups and persons. And I think Chéile is going to talk to us today about the concept of Ubuntu, and talking about how we as social workers can learn from that concept, and how maybe there are many similarities between the Ubuntu concept and social work values, but that we all have a role to play, and any change that we see must come from everyone, and everyone must be part of that change. So if it's okay, I would like to introduce Chéile to take over and at her leisure and speak to us about her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerry. I'm grateful of this opportunity to share my reflections today on World Social Work Day in relation to the theme of racism. I want to thank the organizers of World Social Work Day for giving me this opportunity. The theme of this year's World Social Work Day, as Kerry has already said, is around Ubuntu, which is an African philosophy. I am because we are. The idea of strengthening social solidarity and global connectedness not only resonates with the social work perspective of interconnectedness of all peoples and their environments, but it also correlates with the social work principles of social justice and human rights. Ubuntu is collectiveness, and it's about collectivism and not individualism. I want to talk about how I have been thinking a lot about Ubuntu as an African woman in terms of the philosophy of collectiveness. And I've been reflecting about this philosophy in relation to two global pandemics. And in a minute, I will talk about a little bit about the anti-racism strategy, which we recently launched, which I believe is built on the principles of Ubuntu. So collectivism, not individualism. We saw it following the death of George Floyd, when there was an outcry, a global outcry for justice. I am because we are. So when we look at what happened then, almost 10 months ago, there was a global outcry from civil society and in social work. Globally, social workers rose up in solidarity of supporting those who experience racism. I think about the current COVID-19 pandemic and how globally it's impacting us. Again, I am because we are. You go around walking without your mask on, the impact of that on the collective. Just in the same way that racism impacts us all and diminishes us all. None of us is made better by it. While we are living through these two pandemics, when George Floyd's death happened, through the ISW, we took up, we launched a motion at the AGM, and most people by now will know, and that motion was accepted. And we had talk time sessions around the issue of racism in social work and racism and how it impacts and diminishes all of us. The result of that was the development of the anti-racist strategy that is now on the Irish Association of Social Workers website. So that strategy is up there for anyone who is interested to look at it. We also are calling on social workers that in the spirit of Ubuntu, that within which we developed that strategy, we hope that other social workers are going to join us in implementing the strategy. The strategy is made out of 3 streams. And the three streams are to do with education and research, CPD and practice, and we are also looking at the issue of advocacy and policy. Within these streams, we are thinking and we are challenged by the collective Ubuntu spirit to work together in dismantling racism. So I'm taking this opportunity to call upon and to invite other people who may be interested in joining us to join us, because when we work together, we can make progress. I would like to recommend a book by Mungi Gomane titled Everyday Ubuntu, Living Better Together, the African Way. In this book, Mungi sets out 14 lessons for the philosophy of Ubuntu. And what I got out of it when I was looking at it is that it made me think about the fact that Ubuntu can't just be an idea. It cannot just be an ideal that we talk about. Ubuntu needs to be reflected within our practice as social workers. As we celebrate this day, I want to challenge us to closely think about how we operationalize the spirit of Ubuntu in our practice. Social work, we know, is built on, and there has been arguments that social work is Eurocentric. So I want to challenge us to think about how we respond when we work with people who are culturally different, people who are from diverse cultural, linguistic, religious, or any other diverse background. Ubuntu cannot be realized unless we operationalize it in our practice. It cannot be realized unless social justice is realized. And social justice can't be realized if the way we practice does not call out racism. So racism is something that kills. We know that. We are aware of how people have been killed emotionally, how people have been killed by racism. So I just want to call on us today, on this day, that to call for activism in calling out racism within the profession, in our society, because if we do not, that is against the spirit of Ubuntu. Because, as I've always said, racism diminishes both the perpetrators of it and those who are at the receiving end of it. And for social workers, it's not enough to talk about Ubuntu. It's not enough to talk about solidarity. We have got to act in a solidarity way. We have to act the social justice that is the philosophy of Ubuntu. Because Ubuntu goes beyond just us who are alive. Today, on World Social Work Day, I want to acknowledge social workers who have gone before us. We have lost a lot of social workers in recent times. Without naming their names, I want to conclude my presentation by saying that in the spirit of Ubuntu, today they are watching over us. Today they are seeing us, and we are interconnected. In the African spirit, we are interconnected even with the dead, those that are not living. So yeah, I am going to just conclude and say again and say that I am because we are. And in that spirit, I want to call to ask that for those who would like to see social justice in action, please join us in the implementation of the anti-racism strategy. We are on board, and we have done a lot of work so far, and we hope that other people can also join us to actively be engaged in the spirit of Ubuntu. Thank you.
Coletta, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation to start off the webinar. It's given me a lot of things to think about, but it's also given me lots of hope and lots of optimism and enthusiasm for actually working into the future and kind of, I suppose, working both with yourself, but with hopefully every other social worker, both in the country and internationally, on trying to actually meaningfully realize the concept or the philosophy of Ubuntu as it relates to social work and as it relates to social justice. And I think that piece that you said that Ubuntu cannot be realized unless social justice is realized, but social justice cannot be realized unless we call out racism. That for me just captures what you were saying in a nutshell. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. And I suppose while we may not have time right now, but I do certainly would like you to come back in further on, maybe at the questions and answer section. And one of the questions I had was maybe, how do you think from your perspective social workers can, I suppose, meaningfully, both at an individual but also at the kind of collective level, how can we act or find an expression of Ubuntu in our everyday practice? So maybe that's something you could maybe mull over the next half an hour or so, and we might come back to that when we're talking at the end in our group discussion. So thank you very much, Colette. It's much appreciated. So the next speaker we'll move to now is the wonderful Brian Davis. And Brian is a social work team leader in social inclusion in the HSE, who has been working with the HSE health screening team at Balseskin Reception Centre in Finglas, close to my heart. I used to work in Finglas for the last 5 years. Balseskin is the national reception centre for newly arrived international protection applicants, and it's where most applicants arrive before moving to longer term direct provision centres around the country. And Brian has a really interesting presentation prepared where he'll be talking about social solidarity and global interconnectedness in social work. So without further ado, I will let Brian take the floor. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, thanks very much, Kerry. And thanks Anna and all the team for organising today. It's great to bring people together under these kind of headings and themes. And the way I've kind of structured the brief presentation today is just to give a little bit of background on the social work role in Balseskin and how it fits into the overall direct provision system, because there's not a huge knowledge about it. And then just go on to highlight briefly in terms of the global interconnectedness and the kind of social solidarity aspects of the role. So just for those that don't know, this post was created about 5 years ago. And at the time, it was the only social work post in the country that was directly based in the direct provision system. It's a HSE post, which I'll talk about later. But the good news is, I suppose, it's grown. There's now 2.5 social workers in Balseskin, including my 0.5 team leader post. And there's one full-time social work team leader in IPAS, which is the section in the Department of Children that manages the direct provision system. So slowly but surely, social work kind of influence is growing on the direct provision system, which is great. And there's huge scope for it to grow more over the next few years, particularly with there's a statutory vulnerability assessment that's been introduced for everybody on arrival. And social workers are hopefully going to be leading on that. So there's good. The future is a bit brighter in terms of our influence definitely here. So just for people who aren't aware of direct provision system, this is some photos that have kind of been published about Balseskin. It's the main reception centre. So all asylum seekers, when they arrive in the country, either by boat or by truck or sometimes through the airport, when they declare that they want international protection, they have to register in an office in Lower Main Street, in the International Protection Office, and then they're ultimately, at the moment, after 2 weeks isolation, they're brought to Balseskin. And then from there, I suppose, the process, I'll just go through it. They have get initial temporary residence card, and they get just the basic €38 a week. They're in Balseskin usually only for about 4 or 6 weeks, and they kind of often get some of the basics kind of organised in terms of PPS, lawyer. But the main focus is the health screening, which I'll talk about in a sec. And then they're dispersed. There's now 80 different centres around the country. There's 40 centres, direct provision centres as such, and there's 40 hotels that are used on an emergency basis. So they're sent from Balseskin all around the country, and the system was ultimately managed by the International Protection System and Accommodation Office, which recently moved as part of white paper and reform from the Department of Justice into the Department of Children, Equality, Disability and Integration and Youth. So that's a huge change, and it's very much, I think, from my perspective anyway, it's very much welcome. And as many people know, people can be residing in the long-term centres for years. Prior to COVID, it was about two and a half years for a first answer, and it's probably maybe even longer now. And then that's just what happens for people people coming into their centre. Often in Balseskin, people only get about 2 days notice before they leave. or they're sent to different locations, and then there's limited scope. A lot of people have kind of requests, but unfortunately, we have to explain there isn't necessarily a choice in where you go, but you can make a request. But it's quite hard because like 2,000 to 3,000 people come through Balseskin every year, and vast majority would want to stay in Dublin, or places like Mosney, or places that they might have heard of. It's just hard for IPAS to manage all that. But then in their new location, then they have to set up with GPs and medical cards, and they're just some of the numbers that are coming through, both in Europe, in through Balseskin on arrival, and then kind of more in direct provision system overall. So, in terms of how the social work post is located, it's on the voluntary health screening team. And that's just some of the disciplines that are on that team. Everybody gets invited into Balseskin for a screening. Originally, the main focuses was around kind of just checking for different health particular issues, but now it's expanded, and the nurses can refer on to psychology or social work and GPs. And from there, if there is particular medical issues, they can stay a bit longer in Balseskin, but it's the idea is it's just a reception centre. And when starting the post then about 5 years ago, there wasn't any social workers to kind of speak to about, or no job description as such. And I think in my first, didn't really know what to expect. In the first month in July, there was 7 new referrals. So I thought this was great. This is going to be kind of a handy number, but it expanded very quickly after that, up to about 80 referrals a month. And they're just some of the stats of presentation in just 1 year. So 646 referrals, which is a lot for just kind of one social work post. But you do get a flavour of the global interconnectedness of the role and the different nationalities that are there. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a second. And obviously with each case, you're doing assessments, providing different supports, and helping form a care plan, like most posts, and then linking in with different support agents. But there are some of the issues that are coming up when you meet people on arrival in direct provision. A lot of people, yes, it depends on how and why you present to social work, but that's just some of the issues when people do disclose. Sometimes people might just want in for particular questions that they want to answer to around kind of practical stuff, but also they'll often disclose some of the issues that they're encountering. And you can see from the issues that arise that year, it's very trauma based. The first 3 or 4 in relation to trauma, and then they come into personal and specific issues as well then after that. And that's just some of the issues for families. So that year we worked with 137 parents and minors. 103 were single, and they were some of the issues, single parents, and there are some of the issues that people were encountering or seeking social work support for. And just in terms of global interconnectedness side, you're very, very mindful of world events in our role, and not just in relation to kind of the more well-known wars or even lesser-known wars in Cameroon or Sri Lanka or different places, but also just injustice of different laws around the world, be whether prohibiting homosexuality in Zimbabwe or kind of permission to perpetrate gender-based violence in certain countries. And these are just some of the nationalities that I would have worked with in that year in 2017. So it's 64 different countries that year, but also it's kind of important to bear in mind that each country would often have a mix of different kind of maybe even cultures or tribes. In some countries like Nigeria, there can be up to about 250 different languages or tribes within that country. So the challenge from kind of transcultural practice can be large. But it just gives you a flavour of the different things that are coming into Balseskin every day or every week. In terms of the more global perspective, you will be forgiven to think that everybody's trying to get to Europe. But like overall, there's about 80 million, 79.5 million people are forcibly displaced. 26 million of those are kind of being formalized as refugees, and about 45.7 are internally displaced. So that's not necessarily, they can't be refugees because they're still in their country, but they might be living in camps and considered refugees for a lot of intents and purposes. And then there's about 4.2 million that are still kind of awaiting classification in terms of their applications. And in terms of where, from the refugee perspective, so there 70% come from about 5 different countries. And then in terms of where those refugees are located or kind of residing at the moment, in terms of Europe, Europe's percentage of the 80 million people forcibly displaced is quite small compared to how some people would think. And I'm also quite conscious of the numbers. People can get lost in stats, and always as part of, even with social solidarity, you're trying to bring down the focus onto individual lived experiences. So where you can, you're trying to just, like, that's just a sample of not just that global events can impact people before they leave, but also on their experiences en route. So that's just sometimes a photo that's publicly shared, and you can kind of just be aware of the different expressions and experiences people are, even as they're arriving. That's traveling from Turkey to Greece, the different ages, different children you can see in the photo, and then also just that some have life jackets and some don't. And then these are just some of the refugee experiences around the country. That's Palestinian refugees who had moved to Syria originally, but then Syria was bombed. So that's just a queue for food parcels. So that's, again, just to show different people's experience before they come. And then obviously those experiences can impact on us now. The European laws has affected refugee experiences in Ireland, as I'll talk about in a sec. And then obviously local decisions affect it as well. In terms of how we in Balseskin are trying to respond from a transcultural perspective and all the different global issues that are coming in, that's just one kind of template that we tend to use. It's focuses both on kind of your cultural knowledge and the cultural constructs and how it affects us at all levels of the organization, but you're also looking at your own background and the power, privilege, oppression that's structurally there in society, in terms of political economic aspects or history of colonialism, and how you might challenge some of the structural inequalities that are there. And then also from your own position as your social location that influences you, your gender, your socioeconomic class, your race, and how that affects how you see and do things. And ultimately, you're trying to kind of respond to the needs of people that come into you, and so that they can feel that their needs are met, and how we can better be able to do that. And ultimately, you're ideally hoping that it's a kind of a respectful partnership where you work across cultures and it's characterized by kind of a spirit of inquiry, collaboration, and an attitude of learning and an openness to your own bias, really, that might be there. And this is quite a bit dated, but I find, and there's a lot of different kind of frameworks to assess where different services might be, but that kind of varies from cultural blindness, where people are all treated maybe in an unbiased view, maybe treated equally, up to cultural proficiency, where you're kind of building on differences and augmenting and improving services. But what's very, very common when any services use even the national standards that are in a number of different countries on transcultural practice, or even this, where we as an organization or our colleagues will put us on that spectrum, can often be very, very different to how our service users from different cultural backgrounds can place us. And that can often be a key indication and consideration, I suppose. And leading from that then, just into the concept of social solidarity, how one focus that we try to do is just trying to share the lived experience and highlight and advocate the lived experience to different communities and, I suppose, systemic challenges as well. And some around that is obviously trying to be led by the people's stories. So sometimes to kind of pull back on any biases we adopt kind of Stuart Slavin has a good mnemonic for kind of the 4 C's of culture. So you might be looking, when you're meeting someone, you could be asking things like, what do they call the issue? What do they think caused the issue? How do they cope with the issue? And kind of what are their concerns? And also just trying to get a sense of what do they think a good care or support service is like, and maybe how the issue is viewed in their own community. And is there anything that they want to know to make sure that we know when we're trying to help? And some really interesting things can come from that in terms of people's views of different behaviors and different supports that are offered and insights. And like, I remember one person just highlighting that they really wanted me as a person to understand what it's like to be a victim in their culture. And there are some of the assessments that we wouldn't necessarily kind of focus our attention on, but just their lived experience and how that can impact on their experiences, really. And it helps to highlight the different issues. So there are some of the common things that we would find in Balseskin that can be issues that we would try to highlight, like a lack of information available to residents. There's a big issue around no point of information or support. At the moment, a lot of direct provision centres are run by hospitality managers, and not necessarily any key support workers in the area, but different centres or different services, I suppose. Access to state issue was a massive issue. When I arrived, you needed to be able to speak English and have access to computer to get even PPS numbers. And there's a lot of different sections that weren't able to get PPS or medical cards. But what I find, people just aren't aware. People don't have the voice to highlight the issues or know how to. And secondly, people in management aren't aware of the issues on the ground. So there's a huge role in trying to highlight people's experiences and just asking the question, what does this person do in this scenario, can often get some good changes, really. And then quick transfers, and then people's experience just of loneliness and homesickness and loss of status and things that are familiar in terms of to them and their support structures. So that's kind of their own experience, but structurally there's a lot of anxiety around the permanent status, the length of it, the unemployment, the poverty people are ultimately kind of living in while they're waiting for access to the job market or access to status, and then the conditions but hopefully there are positives that are kind of changing in terms of how social workers responded. Obviously, assessments are very important, incorporating kind of the cultural aspects and trauma-informed practice. And then you're trying to do things that helps the most people with the resources that you have in terms of vision of specialized information and supports and kind of broader welcome meetings. The groups have been interesting. I suppose a lot of research would show that the more culturally, where we started off doing broad groups for everybody, but in terms of a therapeutic aspect, the more focused, culturally aligned groups kind of tend to have the more beneficial for the groups if you're going to do kind of over a number of weeks. So there's constantly evolving in the area. And then obviously advocacy is a huge role, and linking with like-minded groups. And I suppose what I've found, even the ISAW SIG on migration has been great in terms of a group coming together to advocate about similar interests and similar focuses. And we've made kind of submissions to the Department of Justice around direct provision. We've inputted on national standards for direct provision, and the voice together, even as social workers, is a lot stronger through the ISAW as a result, which has been great. And just in terms of just trying to observe a systemic change in the system has been, I think when I started off, I was very naive. I thought I was going to do a welcome group for everybody, similar to how program refugees are managed, which is quite different. But I got a strong email from senior officials saying that asylum seekers are considered to be here illegally and on a temporary basis, and anything I can do can negatively affect or lead to cases against the state. So that's the kind of change that you're trying to work within. I've seen how change has come. So obviously inquiries and major instances sadly have been one focus for change, but also legal cases. The right to work was accessed through a legal change case, and originally the European law being implemented has been a huge change, and legal cases against the government. Back there. Legal cases against the government for not implementing the European law around reception conditions has also been a key change. But I suppose from my perspective, seeing someone like the Minister for Children and Equality, Roger Gorman, making it a red line in government to end direct provision has had a huge positive impact. That's ultimately led to a white paper on ending direct provision and making it a priority, and how it's going to be implemented. So it's interesting times. And these are just some of the changes that have come in terms of the European direction. And what that might mean. But from a social work perspective, this is could be a key one going forward, that it's in law now that everyone should have an assessment whether reception is special reception needs. And reception needs really means is vulnerable and is in need of special guarantees. And there's a lot, while there's still a lot of work in the moment kind of around how this is going to be implemented. There's a pilot there at the moment, but it's a very, hopefully going to lead to a lot of systemic change, where the vulnerability assessment, everybody gets a vulnerability assessment on arrival, ideally social work assessments for the more complex cases, and then that assessment will follow the person through the system. These are kind of some of in the law, these are the kind of categories that are considered vulnerable, and which Department of Children are looking at initially. But then there's a more kind of complex assessment, will be stage 2 of it, hopefully. And the HSE role at the moment is that we need to provide such assistance as is necessary for the performance of these functions. So there's still a lot of things being developed, and ideally the assessment then will follow each person, and it'll be a suitably qualified trained member of staff in each accommodation. We in the SIG have advocated that this person should be a social worker, and it kind of alludes to having a relevant qualification. So we're definitely pushing that each person, which would be great if social workers did the assessments and then there's a social worker to follow up on the assessment when they arrived in their different locations around the country. But this has all been kind of trashed out. But that just kind of gives a summary of where it is in terms of social solidarity and global interconnectedness. And then just going forward, as I see it, obviously our role as social workers, wherever we are, is just kind of promote and learn and advocate from a position of lived experiences, become increasingly aware of our own position and biases that might be affecting how we do our role, and then advocating even among MDTs or different services for kind of culturally sensitive and trauma-informed assessments, and highlight the different systemic aspects in our role, and encourage other services to be as accessible and responsive to different clients, and then a more systemic and anti-discriminative, and I know Claire talked about an anti-racist practice as well. So they're just some of my considerations on World Social Work Day. And thanks, Kelly, for that.
Thank you very much, Brian. I'm just overwhelmed with the amount of information there. And I have to say, from my perspective, it's been just great just to actually learn a little bit more about the internal workings, and I suppose where social work sits and fits and possibly could fit or could lead or could offer solutions into the future, for I suppose such and I suppose I don't necessarily like using the word vulnerable, but such a marginalized populations and groups of people who really do need that sense of solidarity and that sense of connectedness and that sense of understanding and empathy and walking with, as opposed to doing at or doing for. And I think your presentation just gave a really actually great overview of the beginning and then where we are now and what possible solutions or what possible thoughts social workers everywhere and not just working in your particular area but everywhere could really think about and consider. And I suppose one of the questions that came up for me that maybe you could have a think about during the next presentation before we're finishing at the end is maybe what do you think is important for social workers, maybe just in general, to know about in terms of ensuring they consider and act from a kind of a transcultural perspective, because I thought that was an interesting concept and an interesting way that you're working from. And then how can social work, or what solutions can we offer that are based on global interconnectedness and based on that social solidarity approach? So I'd be really keen to hear your thoughts on that after the next presentation, maybe during the Q&A section. And just to remind everyone that there is a Q&A tab, so please do use it. I'm checking it and I don't see lots of questions. So unless you want to hear me rabbiting on and asking lots of questions, I suggest you pop some in there, please, during the next presentation. And I'm sure you will have lots of questions after the next presentation. So our next speaker is the ever excellent Fiachra O'Sullivan from UCC. Fiachra is a college lecturer in social work and social policy in UCC. His research interests focus on genders, sexualities, sexual and gender-based violence, and teaching for the professions and ecological justice, which I'm very excited to hear about. And along with his colleagues Mary Hurley, Catherine Ford and Angela Flynn, he has developed an interdisciplinary module about sustainability and ecological justice for social work, youth work, community development and nursing students. And I think that's what you're going to maybe bring us through now, Fiachra, which I genuinely am excited to hear about, and I think it will round off the afternoon really nicely. So over to you, Fiachra.
Thanks very much, Kerry, and thanks for the very kind invitation to speak on World Social Work Day, and happy World Social Work Day 2021 to everyone. And I very much should say that I'm speaking today with Mary Hurley alongside me, Catherine Ford and Angela Flynn alongside me too, and they all send you their regards as well. And I suppose today I'm hoping to talk to you about where, in particular, Mary and myself have come from as social work educators based in UCC. What we've done in recent years about trying to agitate for increased activism, an increased global outlook, and an increased interrogation of the need for ecological justice in social work education. And at the end, we're going to tell you where we'd like to go and how to keep developing our work. So where we come from, I suppose, very much for Mary and myself, is situated in an ethics of care, which is leaning on some feminist perspectives around, again, collective, shared care for all people and for the living environment. Looking at from a space of activism, both in our professional work, in our educational work, and in our private lives. And I suppose an emphasis on social and ecological justice. And I suppose it's just to pause again to highlight the definition of social work by the International Federation of Social Work, that we as members of the IASW adhere to, hold very strong. And within that is the language of solidarity, the language of respect, the language of emancipation, of empowerment, of liberation, of standing alongside Indigenous peoples and minority peoples, and addressing inequalities in society. And I suppose it's always timely, I think, to revisit this definition to kind of inform what we do in practice, what we do in the education sphere, and what we do in living out the values we espouse. And I suppose going right back to Clement Attlee, who says that every social worker is almost certain to be an agitator, I suppose Mary and myself come as academic activists and agitators, and we argue for a fundamental shift towards ecological social justice, which counters neoliberal hegemony in society. And we believe that the role of social work education demands a pedagogical commitment to develop social responsibility and awareness among students, and to proactively resist the neoliberalization of social work. So we seek to evidence an alternative vision of social work, which authentically coheres with social work's ethical commitment to social justice, solidarity, social change, and global development. And Reich describes what is needed in, I quote, "A shift towards a global way of thinking can help propel social work education beyond the relatively narrow focus programs have adopted in response to dominant neoliberal forces that tend to privilege professionalization, market-based solutions, individual concerns, and clinically oriented work." So we need to look beyond just individualized, responsibilized work and look at solidarity across and with communities. So where we come from, Mary has a lifetime's worth of activism around the environment and ecological justice. If you scratched Mary and she would not bleed blood, she would bleed the environment. She would bleed green. She has campaigned relentlessly around for the Cork Harbour and around to prevent incineration in that space. And when I had known Mary for a long time before I came to work in UCC full-time in 2017. And it was one of the first things that when we sat down and talked about what would our program look like, we talked about where is the environment in the program. And I talking to Mary about saying, look, we have to get it in there. We have to get it in there. It's really important. And I come from a space of activism around LGBT and sexual and gender minority populations and cohorts. I'm involved in alternative financial institutions that focuses on kind of alternative sustainability, sustainable ways of financial operations through the credit union movement, which through our League Foundation operates a lot of cooperative work and helps the cooperative movement internationally in developing countries. And I'm also involved in activist work for empowering young people in care through involvement at a board level with EPIC. So we both kind of come to social work education with a kind of an activist head on us, and wanting to create change and instill activism among our students. So, and really today we want to kind of hopefully talk to you all about being activists, being unapologetically anti-racist, transcultural, and empowering in your work, and also to include that to become green social workers as well. And I suppose where Mary and myself started about 3 years ago now, it feels like last week, we talked about maybe pushing social justice through the classroom door. And we lent on the works of Webby and Straka, Susan Webby in Canada, who talks about how students come to social work education motivated by a desire to help people. But their understanding of how to do this is all too often defined as helping individuals. And so a very important goal of anti-oppressive, for an anti-oppressive social work educator is to help students to catch a social justice vision to motivate their practice. And it's about working with individuals, not on individuals. And so really we felt it was important that the classroom become a place to live out a practice concerned with social justice. So leaving social justice at the door is no longer a viable option. So we developed a workshop with and did some research based on the workshop around activism and discussed this with students. So these were first-year social work students who had engaged, who had been on placement, one placement already. And again, this research, it's a small group, it's not representational, but I think there are interesting findings that emerge from it. So in collaboration with the course management team, and we got ethical approval from the Social Research Ethics Committee in UCC to carry out the workshop and to conduct a study with the students. So it was a reflective class where we asked students to consider and to define activism in the context of social work, so social work activism, and to discuss the external and internal barriers to and benefits of social work activism. So at the end, then we had 24 students who opted to complete the research questionnaire. And from their definition, you can see on the screen, apologies, you can see on the screen the definition that students came up with within the classroom about what constitutes social work activism. And we kind of defined this as kind of maybe going from a passive to very active roles. So things like sharing on social media, retweeting social media. People are tweeting today about hashtag WSWD 2021, but the people retweeting being a passive, or maybe constituting social work activism, right up to writing letters, lobbying, joining a union, going to a public meeting, going on a march, and then taking direct action and protesting. So this is what the students said activism was. And in the class, they talked about the internal barriers, the external barriers, the internal benefits and the external benefits. And it ranged from wanting to speak out, like the benefits being feeling that you're empowering people, external benefits, feeling a sense of solidarity across the profession. Internal barriers were fear, worry about putting your head above the parapet, and external barriers, very much feeling that maybe employers or regulators may not be happy with you speaking out. So key themes that are in the middle there in the orange and in the purple is about the status, about whether the students feeling somewhat disempowered, but also maybe early stage workers or professionals feeling vulnerable, precarious nature of employment contracts, preventing agency and activism, and then also having time, a sense of workload, preventing people to engage in activism. But what was really kind of startling for Mary and myself was that, now again, small numbers, so we can't kind of generalize to everyone, but nearly 3 in 5 social workers describing themselves as non-active. And that is not engaging in activism based on the definition that they came up with. So that includes retweeting. So you're talking about 3 in 5 students saying self-declaring themselves as non-activist. And we very much felt, Mary and I, that we needed to do something about this. So we have changed some of our, with our colleagues, I should say, with support from our team here in UCC, have changed the way we teach explicitly about critical and radical social work, about how we talk about anti-oppressive, feminist, queer social work in our program now. And also we've discussed this and felt the same drive among our siblings in social work education in different programs across the island of Ireland, and know that our fellow educators are equally interested in this. But what was also very clear in that is that nobody talked about the environment at all. And so this definitely meant that we needed to do something. So arising from that, where did we take this? And I suppose just in relation to, again, this ethics of care, we talk about the, I suppose, what Susan Kemp talks about, the importance of when the social work profession remains at the margins of environmental efforts. It both neglects its ethical responsibilities to vulnerable populations and loses its vital opportunities to participate in shaping contemporary responses to environmental challenges, particularly around the interconnections between the environmental and social issues. And I'm really struck by the images that Brian showed earlier and that sense of migration. And we know that between 2030 and 2050, climate change is expected to cause approximately 250,000 additional deaths per year from malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, and heat stress. The United Nations Human Rights Council identified women, children, Indigenous communities, older adults, and persons with disabilities in developing countries as particularly vulnerable to adverse impacts of climate change. And I suppose our Swedish writers, Texeria and Krings, state that environmental degradation is a pressing global problem and is concentrated in oppressed populations and oppressed geographic regions. This matters to our social work clients. The human impacts of environmental challenges fall most heavily on those to whom social workers are most accountable. And this, therefore, has provided us with an impetus for including ecological justice as a component of professional education. And so I suppose Lena Damanelli talks about green social work, and she talks about how social workers can engage around the climate emergency by raising consciousness, by lobbying for preventative measures, by mobilizing communities for change, for dialoguing with policymakers and using the media, and for us, in social work education, for developing curricula that covers climate change and interventions that build individual and community resiliences. So very much Lena's vision here is about solidarity, about working with communities and building resilience, and not allowing neoliberal market agendas to responsibilize disadvantaged groups. And very much the IFSW has been a leader around this and has some fantastic resources on the website. And Aravello uses this triangle, which leans on Maslow's hierarchy of need. And Mary always talks about how this is, as a visual aid, is so helpful to students and to practitioners, that when we talk about the basic needs, that has to be situated on top of the planetary's boundary needs, and that it cannot be kept separate to the living environment. But what can often happen in social work, in helping professions and in health professions, is what's known as anthropocentrism, that everything is, that we can fall into that neoliberal vision that the planet is in service to us as humans, that we as humans are benign consumers of the living planet, and that we should not be responsive and responsible to the environment. And oftentimes in social work, how do we locate ecology in social work education? And oftentimes when we talk about Bronfenbrenner's ecological model, we're actually talking about the social ecology, about how people relate to each other, not about how we relate to the natural living planet around us. And so where did we take that? So Mary and myself engaged with lots of coffee break talks with our colleagues, Angela Flynn in the top there in the poster, and Catherine Ford, who's in youth and community work development work in UCC, about how we had shared desires to include the environment and ecological justice into putting them onto the curriculum for nursing midwifery, youth and community workers, and for social work students. And so we developed an interdisciplinary hub and cluster that started to work towards what's happening right now. And so Mary and myself initially presented in 2019 to all the social work educators on the island of Ireland. And we established this hub with Catherine and Mary and Angela. And we started to craft an interdisciplinary module that would roll out to youth work and community work and social work students. We received a small bit of CAS funding, and we made links, particularly with the IASW, and Cleana was particularly helpful to us, and Danielle in the office, and we really have to thank them for the support that they gave us. And we developed a survey that we've rolled out among educators in 2020, looking at, well, where is the environment? Where are the examples in practice of eco-social, eco-health practice in Ireland? We got some more funding, and we launched a webinar in November, another one last week, and we launched the module in January, where Catherine, Mary and I taught with colleagues, social work students, about sustainability and the environment. And where are we heading now? I suppose really we have started with very little resources, and we've started to develop ways in which we want to embed the UN's Sustainable Development Goals and the ecology in a sustainable way into our curricula. We're building slowly but progressively, and we've made links with other educators across the island of Ireland who are interested in embedding the environment into social work and allied social health professional programs. And we very much believe in a kind of an interdisciplinary approach. We have to think about, I suppose, building back better and looking at how we, post-COVID, post-pandemic, look at how we deliver social work education, deliver youth and community work education, and deliver nursing and midwifery education. And things that we're hoping to do now about embedding sustainability into the ecology of the social work program is looking at ways in which we timetable and deliver the program, how we visit students on placement, types and formats of our assessment, so that we identify sustainable operational mechanisms that operationalize our ecological endeavours. We also want to develop synergies across the curriculum, so that it's not just one module that talks about the ecology and sustainability and global outlooks, and looking at how we can create global perspectives and post-colonial perspectives across our reading lists, across placement opportunities, and again with professional bodies. And very much we want to nourish and create a sustainable growth by aligning with stakeholders across the island, across regulators, and building on a kind of a building narrative that looks at kind of green universities, graduate attributes, that looks for students and graduates to have a global outlook on the world. And with that, very much, I suppose, from our point of view, looking at that, us as a small island nation, but that in our social work education, that we look outwards, that we think about where we send students and when we send graduates, and that our curriculum and that our entire program takes a global outlook. So I hope that connects with everything, and just to say thank you very much.
Fiachra, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. It was beautifully presented, I have to say. Just visually, it was lovely to look at, but also it was really nice, yeah, to listen and hear you talk through it. And I have to say, just, you know, with all three presentations that haven't come to an end, it's really just given me energy and optimism and hope, but also just a feeling of, oh God, there's a lot to do. So without moving over into the oh gosh part, I suppose I just want to say firstly, thank you very much. And I suppose just even for you maybe to be thinking in your head, a question that had come up for me is, especially when I saw the piece around the students' feedback and what they saw as activism, and then that notion of passive to active activism. I'd really like if you could maybe have a think about how or what would you suggest? Like, how can social workers or friends of social workers or anyone in the social work sphere, how can we tangibly kind of make that leap, no matter where we are in our careers, professions, personal lives, you know, any space? How can we kind of make that leap if we so choose, and I hope everybody would choose, from that kind of passive to active stance? So I suppose maybe just to have a think about that. But before I go to each person individually, I kind of wanted to ask you all maybe a kind of a global question, if that was okay, and maybe you could come in one at a time. I suppose there's been common threads through your presentation. So all of you have kind of described your view of, I suppose, the concept maybe of Ubuntu or of that collective piece or global interconnectedness and social solidarity from your own specific areas. But I suppose the common themes or threads I've seen is that while you may be coming at it from different areas and sections, you're not working individually. You're working maybe at the micro level, but you're all very much also connecting to that macro level, whether it be through a special interest group, through the association, through the social work educators group. And I suppose that's on a national level, but also international, that you're very much looking at it from lots of different levels, while also maybe doing the day-to-day work that you need to do and you're interested in doing, and you're looking at changing from that perspective. So I suppose I'd like to know from your perspectives, from everybody listening here, where, and it's a very big question, where do people, or where could people start? Because there's so much, as I said, I wanted to get involved in everything that you've been talking about in all the presentations, but I know I can't do it all by myself. So even just some thoughts on where or how or what people might even just take away from today, in terms of just so they can feel that sense of, I can do something, or I can be involved, or I can do something either at an individual level or a macro level. So maybe we'll just go in order, if that's okay. So Colette, Brian and Fiachra, if you'd like to take it from there. Can you start, Coletta? We can't hear you just now, unfortunately. We might go to Brian if that's okay, and then we can try again in a second. Brian, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, that's no problem. What I was just even thinking about where when you were talking is, yeah, there can be a huge amount there that can be quite overwhelming in each area, but I suppose even each of us, I'd say, can feel that as well, with all the different layers and strands of every sector. What I obviously, social work has been quite good at prioritizing and managing energy, but what I usually sometimes a guide can be what you as a practitioner gives you energy, what can help you to. We all have different things that we get satisfaction and helps us through the week and the month and the longer term career. So that's usually kind of a sense for me in terms of identifying where I'm going to put my energy into is what gives me energy to keep going. And then so that's one aspect. But then even in like in a micro level, it's more around our own assessments and making sure that we asking the right questions in the right way. What's our goals and our assessments, even in terms of priorities, and are people's needs being met? Do people feel that their needs being met after an assessment, or at least being heard and highlighted? So in terms of the activism, I definitely go with well, what we as individuals feel can give us energy where we want to take things forward going in the longer term, and then in a micro level, on a day-to-day, what our priorities are. In day-to-day assessments, things like that.
Thank you, Brian. Fiacre, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I think where people might start, and I know this, people might think that I'm plugging, but I genuinely think that professional bodies are really important. I think in terms of activism, when we talked with the students, when we talked about that fear of, the students talked about kind of whistleblowing as a form of activism, and it is, but it was very much in almost what Mary and myself talked about is almost the kind of the negative way of being an activist, rather than a kind of highlighting kind of faults and cracks in the system, rather than actually kind of lobbying together for change. And one of the things that we talk with students is about actually, solidarity through groups, not that you don't feel you're on your own. I think it can be small steps. We talk with the even in teaching the environment module this term, we had a sense from students that sometimes it was getting a little bit overwhelming for them when how can an individual social worker make loads of change. But then we talked about the things that you can do in your office, in your community, about highlighting for service users, yeah.
That should be okay, hopefully.
Yeah, perfect. But like highlighting, perfect. Highlighting for students and for and in assessments about actually that the inequities that service users experience. So I think that's you can do it at a micro level in how we, as kind of Coletta talked earlier about living the principles by highlighting things in your assessments, and that's what Brian is saying. I think you can do activism through professional bodies and having that safety. And the third thing I'd say is sometimes being an activist when we can be and showing solidarity is amplifying the voice of others who are the experts. So in terms of like kind of, I think social workers are like, that the people that spin plates in the those kind of plate acrobats that kind of spin loads of plates. Maybe we don't have to be the person. Maybe we can be supporting other people and amplifying their expertise, their voices, and that we retweet them, that we come in behind and support other people, that we don't have to lead out on everything, which is again even almost why I feel very guilty that I'm here and not Mary speaking today, because Mary really could speak much better around the environment in particular, and she sends her apologies. She had wanted to be here today, but something came up for her. And but very much I think it's about amplifying other people's voices and supporting other people. And actually that's how I think mutual aid and solidarity gets lived out. It's actually, I'll support you, and in a couple of months' time, by the way, I'm doing this, would you come along and support me? And that actually works really well in social work, I think.
Fiacre, thank you very much. That's a wonderful answer, and I think leads very nicely into Coletta, maybe giving some thoughts on where people could or should start.
Hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Great, that's good. God, it's fantastic what technology can do. I've been having technical problems, but thanks be to God for the phone. So yeah, what can people do and where can people start? I can only talk from my own personal experience. that I think that people can start from within themselves. When George Floyd died, I watched everything that was going on, and I felt driven that I couldn't keep quiet. I'm interested when I hear Fikra talking about activism. I never considered myself as an activist, but something within me told me that this is an injustice. Something told me, but you can't just sit and watch. But with that was a lot of fear of, oh my God, are people going to think I'm mad? So there is a lot of fear when we want to assert our voice. For people like myself, who are not usually speakers, you kind of wonder how to start, where to start. I like what Victor is saying about amplifying other people's voices. I think that's really fantastic, because then if you are like me, you're a bit reserved and you're a bit quiet, you can do, there's so much we can do through that tweeting, through that whatever. We don't all have to be out there holding placards. But what I think is wrong, and I have to say this on World Social Work Day, is not to do anything at all, or not to be a bystander, be it racism, be it climate change, be it the area that Brian was talking about. When we look at those images, they say something to us. When we look at what Sekra was saying, it says something to us. So we somehow, I think we must be moved into action of some sort, be it in a small way, some people are good at writing things. Some people are better at expressing themselves through writing, through the written word, through whatever way. We are all different, but you play to your strengths. You look at yourself. What is it? How can you not be a bystander? You can't just see racism and let it go. You can't see somebody doing something that hurts the climate, and which has an impact on the service users that we work with. You can't look at somebody not treating people who are seeking asylum or saying something against them and not say something. I'll tell you something that I said to social work students last week. I was talking to social work students in some university, I won't mention what, and we were talking about this very topic of activism, of doing something. And again, I remember students saying, but Coletta, the people who employ you are the people who pay your wages. Sometimes the policies within there are not quite right, and it's difficult to challenge those policies. And I remember encouraging that, look, as social workers, advocacy is about that, and charity begins seriously at home. And if we don't speak up about policies that don't work for the better of the service user or for the better of our practice, well, then we are party to a system, a neoliberal system that Sekra talked about, which oppresses and undermines people. So we can't be social workers and just think that, oh, well, in my own words, actually, I say that it's like prostituting our own values. So it's almost like we're selling our soul. That is our soul, to speak up, to be heard, to challenge in whatever way. There is never a set way for anybody. In our own way, we are able to get our voice in. Sorry, I talk too much. I'll stop there.
That's perfect, Coletta, and actually touches on the question I had actually asked previously, which is wonderful, and also the current question I was asking everybody maybe to feed back on. And I think, yeah, for what's coming through clearly is that, one, everybody can do something, and two, that everybody should do something. because it's better to do something, and not, you know, not just anything, but to do something that's considered, and to do something that is in line with our values and ethics, and with maybe the philosophy of Ubuntu, as we're in the theme for World Social Work Day, but that we do it, and we do it together. So I think that that's coming through clearly from the three answers, and I appreciate that. And I have to say thank you to the people who submitted questions on the Q&A forum. You're very good. We have two questions actually. One is for Brian, and then the other one actually I'll ask everyone maybe to give their thoughts or input on it. So Brian, just quickly for yourself, just there was a very specific question, a querying around language. So is it an issue in your role, and how do you actually manage it? And I'm presuming there might be assistance by translators, etc. But even if you were able to just comment briefly on that.
Yes, yeah, we're lucky enough in Boston that we have access to two interpretation companies, so we can get an interpreter within 5 minutes over the phone, and then 24 hours for face-to-face. So that's not an issue. I know there is in a lot of other services. There's a kind of quite a rigmarole in terms of trying how you apply for and get funding for it. And I suppose like the Equality Act is quite strong on that. We will come across a lot of services that don't provide interpreters, but the legislation is actually quite strong in supporting advocacy for someone being able to access the service and not be discriminated based on language. So there's grounds for that. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Brian. Thanks very much. And then just if you could all maybe comment briefly just on the other question, which again is a general one for everyone, and you've probably all touched on it slightly, but it's just a slightly different angle. So the question from one of the attendees is, how can we influence change towards a more proactive view of social work as a promoter of rights and justice at that organizational and macro level, as well as then within our own maybe teaching or practice, like you've all maybe talked about in the previous answer. So if you'd have maybe some thoughts on that, we might start again with Brian, then go to Fikar, and then Coletta.
We can, I suppose, yeah, kind of slightly related to the global interconnectedness things. There's a lot of people with what I've found just in this work over the last 2 years. There's a lot of people with shared focus and shared interests that aren't necessarily aligned or connected. Like we have our own networks, and each people we meet have their own networks, but there's actually a huge amount of shared resources there that we don't always maximize or improve to use to improve our practice and kind of situations both in Ireland and around the world. And social workers are actually quite good at navigating complex systems and competing interests and responsibilities of other services and other disciplines, and kind of picking the right battles at the right times. So yeah, I think one thing I find is sometimes, depending on line management structure, there can be roadblocks, there can be and the different hierarchies, but again, highlighting the different lived experiences of people, and also having enough people together to highlight as an issue. So things like the ICW has been great forum for that. Yeah, and just I think there's a lot of other collective resources out there that we don't always look for or kind of reach out to and learn from and assist where we can. So that's really one just example. Is even trying to find other social workers around Europe who do a similar job to assessments of people on arrival is quite hard. I just didn't know. I couldn't find anybody that does it, or even around Europe, let alone Ireland. So just having the right kind of networks and building networks and having the right access to the right people can really help with change, is what I find.
Fikar?
So I'm going to be like a magpie, and I'm going to like highlight bits that Coletta said and highlight bits that Brian said, and then I'll maybe put in bits. I think one thing that's really important that Coletta said is about that value base. So actually, first of all, for me as a social work educator, it's like when we recruit people onto the program, that we recruit people that have value bases that align with the value bases of social work. So it's really important that so we look at that value base. Then leaning on what Brian is talking about, networks. I think one I was a social work manager for many years, and one of the skills that I would talk to students that would come out in placement and newer social workers is networking is something that we don't really talk about in college that much, but actually networking is really important to find people who have similar values and actions. Just as Brian's saying, like, you know, it can be lonely at times when you're on the pedestal shouting out and saying this has to change. So finding people wherever they are across the globe that have a similar viewpoint. And sometimes I say to students, you know, when our students at the moment are writing dissertations and they all think they've come up with something highly original that no one else in the universe has ever thought about in relation to social work, and they come to me and they say, I can't find anyone who's written about this. And I say, start searching that library, search engines. I bet you somebody has written something on that. And what I would say is that in terms of what we do and how we practice, there are people out there in the world that will think the same as us, and you find them, and that helps you to help you. So again, it's that sense of not being on your own. You're never alone. Like how we work together. I would say to someone, maybe deciding and being responsive to something is, you know, you don't be a lone wolf on this, you know, be a pack animal, find other people and maybe together work on something. And as Coletta was saying, there are people that are better writers. There are people who are better at speaking up at a team meeting or writing policy. And you know, the person who writes can shove the thing to say in front of the person who can speak out. And that's how we do it. From an education point of view, I think it's, first of all, we have to be, and I think there's an appetite across all of the, as I said, all of the programs in social care and programs in nursing and midwifery to be very explicit about our value bases and putting it out in our handbooks. But also then I think there's things that we are talking about how do we empower at the student level, ability to engage with policy writing, policy critically analyzing policies, looking at structural levels. I think in a world where we're getting very much almost talking about programs almost in a training way, that you teach this toolkit and you analyze it, that we actually have to think at a much more deep level around, well, think of critical thinking here now. How does this impact? Look at structural issues. Look at how politics plays out and how social policy impacts the practice that we have to do, the context. I think Brian gave a really fantastic example of that, about things that he wanted to do, but being told, look, well, actually that there's a policy and a political backdrop here, and that shows. And so we have to teach students from an early stage at an entry point. So we have to give them the tools, but the tools, I think, aren't about how to do something. Sometimes it's maybe how to question, how to critique, how to wonder about, how to trouble, how to unsettle oneself. I think they're the things that we need to be teaching. So that's how we help social workers. And then the other thing is, what I say to all practitioners out there, inside UCC, thankfully, I have access to billions worth of journal articles and books and resources. And I say to students, you know, when you leave, don't be afraid to send an email to say, do you have anything about this? And I can go, and I say that across all the educators in all the programs across Ireland are so don't think that your training ends after 2 or 4 years or however long it takes. They're always maintain that connection with the higher institutions across Ireland.
Thank you, Fiacre, very much. Coletta, would you like to give
Can
your
you
thoughts?
hear me?
I can indeed. Work away.
Okay. What was the question again, Carrie? Not that I wasn't listening.
No problem. No, I suppose it was the question was around how can social work be maybe more proactive around showing that we're working from a rights-based perspective, and how can we promote that in that broader kind of macro sphere? And I suppose it was echoing maybe what you had all input previously.
Yeah. How can we be proactive? I suppose by doing something. I echo what Brian and Fiacre have said. What strikes me very much is what they both said around solidarity and working together. Yeah, I think that when I can only talk from my experiences of coming out of my shell and putting myself out there. I can say that solidarity and working together is so, so important in terms of when I started, when I got it in my head that we needed to do something. I can honestly say the Ubuntu in the development of the anti-racism strategy within the ISW was a collective effort from the members of the ISW. This was an issue that was there. And I like what Bekra said around, and Brian said it too, around how different people can come in with different strengths. I remember you, Carrie, when we couldn't say the word racism because it's such a dirty word, that I used Carrie to be just a catalyst. Somebody would come in the background and say the word so that we could actually start to have the conversation. I was afraid to say the word because sometimes I think it sounds better coming from somebody else who doesn't look black, for example. So there's always a room and a space for everybody to work together collaboratively to build something. And in the ISW, I can honestly say that the membership, people are interested in different issues. And you're always going to find someone who will jump onto climate change, who will jump onto asylum seekers, refugees, who will jump on, and all these issues at the end of the day are interconnected. We are all doing the same. We're all in the spirit of social justice, trying to aim for the same goal. So I would just encourage people to take a leap of faith to see whatever you are interested in. It's all there. It's either there in the special interest groups or in the activities that are happening. And a lot of things are member-led. You are a member and you want to get in there. The doors are so open. I mean, Flina sitting there is she's very supportive in terms of CPD, helping social workers to grow and to tap into what it is that their needs in terms of professional development. I talk about CPD as really pivotal to the Irish Association of Social Workers because there sometimes is a gap between what we learn in college and when we go into practice, how we progress from that. Sometimes there is a bit of a gap between theory and practice because when we are overwhelmed by case laws, when we are overwhelmed by other things, we can tend to get a little bit strained. So I just find the ISW CPD space as a hub where you can be re-energized, regain momentum again through the energy of other people to pick up something and learn and keep developing professionally.
Coletta, thank you so much, and that is a perfect response to wind up and finish off the webinar. I genuinely want to say thank you very much to you all. It's been an honor to be able to chair this webinar and listen to the three of you. It's definitely made me happy and excited to be part of the social work family. It's also been really nice just to actually take a moment or two to sit back and listen and think and evaluate, and I suppose get ready for whatever the next year brings us. And I hope that the next year won't be as exciting as the last one has been, but if it is, I am very sure that we can all handle it and we can all manage it. And I think that we will be able to, if we kind of channel what the three of you have talked about today and really try to, I suppose, keep that sense of social solidarity and interconnectedness between us all. So I would like to say thank you to all of you for attending. I wish I could see you all, but I'm assuming you're there. It's been wonderful and I appreciate your interaction throughout the session. So take care, everyone, and stay home.
Thank you.